We do have competing folks in the room, and we are potentially competing people in the room. So we're going to try and stay away from any questions around pricing and markets and all those kind of fun things. Please put your questions into chat. Wesley has a ton of information to go through, so we probably won't have time to interrupt him during the middle of his presentation for questions, but just please do put them in the chat. One other housekeeping item: we don't have a mute all for this button for this program, so you're gonna have to make sure you mute yourselves. The last time we did this, we had one person who unmuted and they were in the ordering a burger. So please keep yourself on mute, and we appreciate that very much so. We're gonna have an announcement at the very end also, and some reminders. I'm gonna remind you guys at the front and then again at the end to please, if you signed up for this first webinar, you haven't signed up for all three. You've only signed up for this one. So go back to your LinkedIn links and go and sign up for the other two webinars. I had to do that myself today because I forgot the same thing. So don't let yourself get caught in that position. Okay. Wesley Snell was on the working group that developed this new procedure for ecosystem services. We're very glad to have him here with us. He's coming to us from Italy, although he's from the U.S., from North Carolina, mountains of North Carolina. He currently lives and works for Etifor in Italy. And so he is in a little bit longer time zone than I am in the East Coast of the United States. So for me, it's 1 o'clock. For Wesley, I believe it's 7. So Wesley, thank you very much for being available for us. If we had it any earlier, it would have made it too early for anybody on the West Coast of the United States. So this is actually a very good time for us in the US, but I know it's difficult for Wesley because he's working at 7 o'clock at night. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the expert and let him share screen and do all the things and wow you guys with a bunch of information that's really cool. So Wesley, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon to what I assume is most of you. Good morning to some, and like Tom said, it's a good evening to me. I'm going to share my screen real quick because I'm just going to blast through a lot of information for you guys. Can you guys see my screen? I see it's the whole screen. How's that? Yep. Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm just going to dive right in. So, like Tom said,
Yes,
this
I
is
can.
perfect. Great. So like Tom mentioned, this is the first of a three-part webinar series. So I'm going to do an introduction to verified impact. We'll be talking about what is the role of FSC and this new procedure in addressing the climate and nature crises. I'm actually going to spend most of the time talking about the context that we're working in here. So what is the need for verified impact? What sort of risks is it trying to address? So I'm going to be just sort of socializing the topic of what is climate and nature related risk. What are the economic implications of these risks? What are the different voluntary and policy responses to these risks that we've identified? What are investors looking for? And then I'll move more into the role of FSC verified impact, although I'll be covering the actual procedure in much more detail in the next two sessions. Basically, the idea here is to identify what is the business case and what is the need for having a procedure like this. But really quick, I'm just going to introduce myself and the organization that I'm working for while I'm in this room leading this call. So like Tom said, I work for an organization called Etifor. We are a environmental consulting spinoff of the University of Padova here in Italy. And at Etifor, we put nature at the heart of decision making by developing science-based solutions. So we do work, it's quite varied, our work. We do a lot of work in sustainability consulting, so developing climate and nature-related strategies for private companies and financial institutions, to a lot of project development and forest management consulting, especially around the use of the procedure. I'm a forester by background, just so everybody, with a specialization in impact measurement and working in carbon biodiversity and water impact measurement and valuation. So we got our hands in a lot of pies. Let's say when we talk about nature and we talk about valuing nature, we're often talking about bringing together a lot of very disparate disciplines. We have projects all over the world. So we've worked with over the last 10 years with more than 1,000 clients on every type of project you could imagine in the nature consulting space, in project development, climate target setting, fund structuring and development is our sort of private sector work, but we do engage a lot with public institutions as well at local, regional, and even multilateral levels. Um, and we have a very deep experience with applying the ecosystem service procedure with, I think it's, fair to say a fair amount of success for a procedure that is still finding its feet in some ways. So we've helped more than 40 certificate holders, different forest managers, verify positive impacts for 5 ecosystem services so far: water, carbon, biodiversity, soil, and recreation. And perhaps more to the point, we've used this verification tool to bring more than 200 sponsors and raise more than $10 million to support these forest managers, contingent on them verifying their impacts through the procedure. The majority of these forest managers are SLIMPs, so small, low intensity managed forests, smallholders and conservation oriented forests. And it's everything from sort of direct private sector financing or contributions to blended finance models with public and private institutions. We set up a model here, for example, with the Lombardy region where Milan is based. To come up with a 5 million structured deal on improving local, national, regional parks in the area, verified through the procedure. This table on the left was a study from WWF in 2022 that shows uh, uh, sort of a current state of the art of the ecosystem service procedure from FSC, the older version, version 1, and all the sponsorships that have been raised, and the ones that are highlighted in red, and those red boxes are those where Etifor played a pivotal role in raising sponsorship. So we have quite a lot of experience not only in applying the procedure, but making a strong business case for it and raising finance for it. Just a quick sort of housekeeping about this webinar series. So it's in 3 parts. I'll be doing an introduction today, sort of for a general audience and I've already covered the topics that we're going to go over. The next 2 sessions are aimed at 2 sort of more specific audiences. So the second session is about applying the ecosystem service procedure. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts and the technical requirements. So we'll go through the 7 steps: how to develop a theory of change, how to choose a methodology and measure and report your outcomes. And this is mainly geared toward forest owners, managers, and certificate holders. The third session is more aimed toward those in forest product supply chains or for private companies or financial institutions who are curious about the procedure and how they can benefit from the claims that they generate. So this is going to be really aiming at what is the role of sponsors in the procedure, where we're going to really sort of drill down on climate and nature-related financial disclosures, value chain engagement, net zero nature positive claims, etc. So it's every Tuesday for the next 3 weeks, and I hope that you guys get to attend all of them. Okay, so fundamentals. I'll talk about nature risk in the economy, how the voluntary and policy spheres are responding, what sort of signals we're getting from institutional investors, private equity, et cetera, and then we'll talk more specifically about FSC. The first and really important thing, the jumping point for this conversation, is to understand Earth systems and planetary boundaries. And the principle is basically this: our economy, our well-being, the stability and economic security of our lives depend on stable, secure, and self-regulating Earth systems. So these are things like biogeochemical flows, stable climate regimes, healthy atmospheric compositions, diverse and large areas of natural and intact space, biosphere integrity, clean water, etc., right? And to a certain extent, these systems that operate very much at a planetary level, they can assimilate our impacts. So everything that we do has an impact to some extent on these Earth systems, whether we're directly using raw materials or our waste or energy use or whatever it may be. And up until now, and for a long time, and still now, these systems have space to absorb our impact and assimilate it. But beyond a certain threshold, the systems start to break down. And we've already exceeded 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. So phosphorus and nitrate loading, freshwater consumption, water pollution, land use change and fragmentation, functional and genetic biodiversity are severely compromised, carbon dioxide concentrations and radiative forcing from the atmosphere, the introduction of novel entities like, for example, I don't know, cement or plastic as another example. Um, and so what I'm trying to say is that uh, oftentimes when we talk about our impact on nature, it goes through a climate change lens. But as we can see, we're having a much broader impact, and all of these systems which interact with each other are starting to break down. Now, what's driving this nature crisis? EatBest, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has identified a few key drivers. These include land use change, the direct exploitation of natural resources, climate change and emissions, pollution, invasive alien species. And these are all in a very coupled and dynamic way, interrelated way, driving a lot of the nature loss that we're seeing, and the capacity of systems to provide us with resources and assimilate our impacts. Now, why is this important beyond, outside of a moral or ethical conversation, but looking at it through an economic lens? Um, very, very, very simply put, 100% of our economy is 100% dependent on nature. And we can break that down and be more specific. There have been some great studies recently on our economic impacts and dependencies on nature. We see that more than half of the global gross domestic product is moderately to heavily dependent on nature and ecosystem services, and very much exposed to significant risk from nature loss. And this is very clear in things like the forestry sector, forest product sector. But there are also many industries that exhibit hidden dependencies within their supply chains, on up to more than 50% of the gross value added in their products. If you think about it, everything that we use, everything that goes into our economy, everything that we consume, that we buy, that we sell, if it's a physical product, at some point it was or engages with physical products, at some point that was either harvested out of the soil or mined out of the earth, right? Um, and we're starting to classify these risks, nature-related risks, in a much more systemic and codified way. So there are 3 main types of nature-related risk. There are physical risks. These are the ones that you're probably the most familiar with. So extreme climatic events, hydrological events, flooding, fires, extreme heat, drought, chronic changes in ecosystem services over time, the ability of insects to pollinate crops, etc. There are also what are called transition risks. And these mean, in a nutshell, that we've seen a really large policy push at a global level and at a national level to transition our economy toward a net zero and more nature positive framework. And companies or financial institutions who are not adapting to this face a risk of abrupt policy changes that will force them to spend more money in order to catch up, basically. Um, so there basically transition risk is an umbrella term for the ability for companies to manage policy changes or shifts in market preferences, their social license to operate, etc. Um, And what we see is that financial institutions, credit rating agencies, investors are integrating nature-related topics in their assessments with a really strong focus on these physical and transition risks. So what is the type of risk? What is driving it? How do those risks manifest? And what's their root cause? What is the impact on the company, whether it's a disruption of their operations, their value chain? It affects the pricing on their raw material sourcing. It forces them to adjust or relocate their activities, in some cases, even stranding their assets, like especially in coastal economies. And what is the resultant financial risk? Is it a credit market liquidity? How is this actually impacting the company? Um, and we're seeing that, and the estimates, let's say, of even the committed costs right now from climate and nature-related risks are pretty dire. There's a really interesting study that just came out, was published in Nature in April of last year, uh, that projects a real income loss per capita of about minus 20% within the next 25 years, regardless of our future emission choices. So from today, regardless of whether we actually transition to net zero or not, we're locked in with our current emissions and the resultant risk to real income loss that's going to be felt at an individual level. When we talk about this at a corporate level, and we're in the context of climate and nature-related risk, we often talk about what is material for the organization. So what might actually manifest as a risk or have an impact on their ability, on the continuity or success of the enterprise. And when we talk about materiality, there's typically two types. It's called double materiality. They're considered in tandem. So one is financial materiality. And what this means is how a company depends on nature, and what are the resultant risks from climate change, from collapsing biodiversity, from water scarcity, et cetera. And this really varies from company to company if you're in at different segments of the value chain. So if you work in, I don't know, if you are in the pulp and paper sector for the processing, you need a tremendous amount of water. And if your processing mill is located in an area that's suffering from water scarcity, how can that translate to future financial risk for your organization? Are you going to have to pay more for water, increasing tariffs, increasing water rates? Is the water not going to be available? Might the asset be stranded in a couple of years, 10 years, 20 years, et cetera? And this is really sort of company and sector dependent. Then we also talk about impact materiality, and that is how a company's actions or economic activities impact nature and the communities that we live in. So how much emissions or water consumption or land use are we attributing to a company, and what is that creating any type of risk or pressure on nature? Uh, and also nature's contributions to people nearby or globally, right? And at the same time, we're wrestling with an issue that I think probably everyone's familiar with, which is that we have a massive financing gap for covering these large transition plans toward net zero or a nature positive world. So the current estimates are about 9 plus or minus 3 trillion annually by 2030 in order for us to deliver on our Paris Agreement targets. And that's about 5 times our current levels. In the agriculture and forestry sector alone, we need about a 35-fold increase in climate funding. From 16 billion up to about 560 billion a year in order for us to transition properly. We see similar, let's say, lower total costs, but similar gaps in terms of biodiversity and nature financing. We're looking at about a $700 billion annual financing gap for nature services. But we also see that in terms of a roadmap for us to close that gap, that green financial products, wood-based bioeconomies, and sustainable supply chains are going to play a really important role in closing that gap. So that's the first section. The basic key messages here, and I'm going to share this presentation with everyone at the end, is that all of our economic activity both impacts and depends at some level or at some point in the supply chain on natural capital and ecosystem services. These impacts and dependencies generate risks and opportunities, both in terms of the financial effects on the organization and for nature and society. We typically talk about physical and transition risks as a way of codifying or typifying these risks. And there's a large financing gap that needs to be filled, and we already see a lot of activity toward closing these gaps. So those are all of the problems. Now we can talk about some of the responses. And I don't know how many of you are working in this space or especially in the policy space, but it's just been dizzying the last couple of years how much legislation, policy, multilateral agreements have come out in order to try to address these climate and nature crises. In the voluntary space, we saw the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and Science-Based Targets for Nature came out last year, which I'll talk more about in the third session. We see that IFRS and ISSB, so the major standards for international financial reporting, are integrating sustainability criteria and reporting into their standards. And we've seen also a really huge push in this nature positive space, which I'll talk about briefly in a second. In the policy sphere, we saw the release of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the nature equivalent of the Paris Agreement. And there's been a tremendous amount of activity about that in the years since. That came out a couple of years ago. And we also see in the EU as well as in the States a lot of stricter, much more standardized, a convergence, we can say, around what is the private sector's duties, their obligations toward measuring, assessing, managing, and reporting their climate and nature-related risks. So we see this from governments, financial institutions, insurance carriers, regulators, creditors, investors. There's been sort of a twin push from the public space and also from the finance sector on really drilling down on managing these topics, which I'll also talk about more in just a second. I'll skip this. This is just to say that we also see it sort of entering the mainstream discourse. We're seeing it in a lot of news outlets. There's a lot more conversation and activity around, we can say it translates to reputational risks and opportunities for companies in the nature positive and climate space. It's something that consumers are also expecting. And what we're really talking about are two main objectives. One is net zero, and the other is nature positive. And I get this question all the time, so I thought it might be worth just briefly explaining the difference. So when we talk about net zero, we're talking about a global objective to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, or 2 degrees, let's say, at the maximum. This is sort of housed under the Paris Climate Accord. At a business level, at a corporate level, the expectations are for corporates to set net zero or climate neutral targets around their greenhouse gas emissions and setting targets with a benchmark of net zero by 2050, covering their scopes 1, 2, and 3 of their emissions accounting, which, if you're not familiar with that, I will also be talking about that more in the third session. On the nature positive side, which is very complementary, we're talking about a global goal for nature. So to halt nature loss from 2020, reverse the trend of nature loss by 2030, aiming toward full recovery of nature by 2050. And this is housed under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. At a business level, there's still a lot of work in standardizing what are the expectations for corporates in terms of engaging with nature. And it really varies, unlike climate, which is pretty cut and dried and every company has a similar target. what is important is for businesses to manage what's material for their organization and their value chains. And this typically translates to a basket of local targets that are adapted to your material impacts, dependencies, risks, or opportunities related to water, related to biodiversity, to land use, pollution, etc., right? And the scope of this commitment is the direct operations. So what a company has legal, financial, or equity control over, as well as the value chain. I don't think I have time to go into too much detail about these different policy frameworks. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. But a couple that might be relevant to know is from an EU perspective, there's been a sustainable finance package that's been released and is currently being rolled out in the EU, which has three main parts. So one, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which codifies what companies of a certain size are obligated to report in terms of their impacts on climate, biodiversity, water resources, etc. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which governs how investment funds can label themselves and market themselves and raise funds under green labels, and the EU taxonomy, which very clearly spells out what classifies as a green or sustainable activity and what doesn't. Back on the state side, we saw last year that the SEC finalized the rules for climate-related disclosures. Excuse me, just took a sip of coffee. And what this is requiring is at least scopes 1 and 2 emissions reporting and transition plans toward net zero in the near term, at least for large accelerated filers. But others over the next few years will also be obligated, both with limited assurance in the short term and reasonable assurance in the long term. At a state level, we see examples from California, but there are plenty of others as well around that are very clearly spelling out how companies need to be measuring their scopes 1 and 2, so the emissions associated with their direct operations, as well as the emissions associated with their value chain. And they're using the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures as a template for how to structure these disclosures, what to measure, what to report, etc. And for all of these, for the EU, the CSRD, for the SEC rules, for the California Accountability Package, when we talk about these nature-related standards and disclosures, they all follow a very similar structure, which is to describe the governance. So how are companies governing? Who is in charge and who's responsible for? How does information pass to them? How do they make decisions about budget expenditures, business model, transition plans and strategy, etc. What is the strategy? So what is the approach the organization uses to manage climate or nature-related issues? Risk management, so how organizations identify, assess, prioritize, and manage these risks. And then what are the metrics and targets that companies or financial institutions are using to track their progress toward either their voluntary or their legally mandated targets? And when we talk about the scope of reporting for all of them, except for the SEC on large accelerated filers, but in all of the voluntary space and in most of the policy space, we see that the obligation of responsibility, the obligation to assess, manage, and report is both the sphere of control, which is the direct operations, what the company, like I said before, has financial management or equity control over, but as well as the sphere of influence. And you have to specify what is your degree of influence on both your upstream value chain and your downstream value chain. So what are the key messages here? The main one, and it's one that it's a key point that I really can't stress enough, is that nature climate issues are no longer just a sort of philanthropic corporate social responsibility topic. They are a core and strategic risk management issue. and one that credit rating agencies, investors, auditors are asking information for in a very structured way alongside financial data. There's been just an eruption of nature-related policies, disclosures, frameworks, coalitions, actions, plans, etc. And what we see, unlike sort of the early days of carbon neutral, climate neutral commitments, let's say from maybe 10 years ago, there's a really strong convergence on the scope, breadth, and disclosure requirements. It's much more organized, it's much more specific. The assurance systems are much more sophisticated in terms of how you assess, manage, and report. And the focus, like I said before, is not only on your direct operations or assets that you own or manage, but also on the value chains and how you conduct your due diligence, your risk management, and engagement. All of this is creating a pretty serious transition risk for many organizations who are unprepared for these policy shifts. So that's the policy perspective. What about the investor side? So what are investors asking for? We've seen a very clear trend over the last few years that ESG is becoming a really important, a fundamental investment criteria. It's been a little shaky. It's off to a shaky start in the States, and there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of attention on it recently. And you see it now go by many different names I found in the States compared to the EU, for example. But the trend, I think, is very clear and very obvious, which is that investors want ESG criteria built into in an organization's business model and their strategy and their future planning and budget expenditures. They see it very often from a risk management perspective and an added value. They want to see that, and they want to invest more and find organizations who are working with their suppliers to build sustainable value chains, who are building climate-related risk and transition plans into their business model, into the way that their products are made or distributed. And really importantly, who can show that they are building, they know what their climate or nature-related risks are and how they're building resilience toward them. Okay. It's a very, very clear trend. I work with a lot of financial institutions as well, and we see there's just they're quite hungry for it. And we often see that they're willing to pay more. They're willing to pay higher fees for ESG funds. A recent study from PwC from a couple of years ago showed that more than half of investors would be willing to accept a 20 to 40 basis point increase in fees for ESG funds, which translates to real value for the asset owners, managers within these funds. And more than half would also accept variations in the fee that are based on ESG performance. So linking remuneration, investment, equity, debt structures around our companies setting net zero targets and are they delivering on them, for example. So we see that most investors, 3 out of 4, agree that sustainability is an important factor in their investment decision making. But at the same time, 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10, believe that a lot of corporate reporting, a lot of claims made by corporations contain unsupported sustainability claims. They're unsubstantiated, or basically they're greenwashing. So there's a really high demand, but there's also a tremendous amount of skepticism, and they're asking for the receipts. They're asking for proof, right? The key messages here being that investors are willing to pay more, but again, they're quite skeptical. And the way that they're expecting companies to assess, manage, and disclose is following these benchmarks, these best practices, these external standards. They don't really want companies to go it alone or make up their own way of doing it. There are plenty of resources, disclosure standards, target setting standards, etc., that are available in order to show a clear alignment with the Paris Agreement or GBF targets. But what they want is transparent disclosures of these impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. They want to see time-bound, location-specific and science-based targets, and evidence-based action plans and reporting on their progress. They want to see strong governance, strong due diligence systems, and risk management policies. And there's a really strong emphasis right now on supply chain engagement, on no conversion and no deforestation commitments, and on restoration targets in particular. Okay, that's sort of the context that we're working in, that we're looking to discuss FSC verified impact. And I'm going to briefly introduce the procedure and talk about its role, how it can contribute or help forest managers or sponsors contribute to these goals. But again, I'm going to talk much more about them in the next two sessions. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the FSC Ecosystem Service Procedure, which is now known as FSC Verified Impact, is a impact demonstration framework. And it's a way for auditors to verify the positive impacts of forest management activities on 7 types of ecosystem services. And the way that it does that is it sets quality thresholds and reporting requirements that allow outcome indicators and methodologies flexible enough to be suitable for the local context, but credible enough to be auditable, to be communicated with reasonable assurance. It's also set up in a way that reduces the risk of unintended consequences. It has stringent social and environmental do no harm safeguards, benefit sharing requirements, strict limits on what activities qualify, what kind of claims can be made with them, how can we manage greenwashing claims associated with it. And what it produces are quantified, externally verified, and annually audited impact claims that allow forest managers to access markets for ecosystem services. And if you're not familiar with it, we're already seeing quite a lot of uptake. More than 70 forest managers have applied the procedure all over the world. This map that you see here is a little bit old. I'm waiting for an updated map from FSC International. This is from a few years ago. But we know that there's more than 5 million acres verified right now for positive impacts on carbon and other ecosystem services. What is the scope? So what can you verify positive impacts for? There are 7 ecosystem services verifiable under the procedure, or 37 impacts which are eligible for verification sort of across the board. So you can verify impacts for biodiversity conservation, like enhanced forest cover, species diversity conservation, enhancement of natural forest structure, improvements in functional diversity, the maintenance of rare, threatened, or endemic species. There's 12 impacts there, which you can verify. Carbon sequestration and storage, so maintaining or enhancing your forest carbon stocks through different specific activities, afforestation, responsible management, or conservation. On watershed services, mainly focused on the maintenance or enhancement of water quality or water volume regulation. Soil conservation, which mainly relates to quality and structure or reducing erosion. We also have recreational services and cultural practices. So in maintaining or improving socio-ecological benefits from forest recreation or tourism, as well as the maintenance or enhancement of cultural or ancestral knowledge practices in local language, and air quality. So the capacity of forests and specific activities in the forest to maintain or enhance air quality. And what's really important is the verified impact and the procedure are all of these services and all of these impacts are co-equal. So unlike other standards, some of which I work with, carbon standards, for example, it's not that you focus on carbon and biodiversity or water or community benefits are a nice plus. The procedure gives you the flexibility to identify any of these services or impacts and verify that you're having a positive impact on them. The way the procedure is set up, there's 7 basic steps. And I like to group them typically under 3 categories. So there are, you show that you meet the prerequisites and safeguards for applying the procedure. and identify the context that you're implementing these management activities to improve them. So you identify the current and past condition, who are the beneficiaries, what are the major threats that you're trying to address, things like this. Then you demonstrate the impact. So you link measurable outcomes to specific management activities using a theory of change. You select a methodology for measuring them. The procedure is quite flexible in which methodology you can pick as long as it meets certain quality thresholds. And then you measure and report the impacts and you show that there's a positive impact. And then at the end, you generate claims. Once you can demonstrate either the maintenance or enhancement of an ecosystem service, you generate claims, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And for those of you who are more curious or want more information, I'm really going to go into much more detail about this specifically in the next session. So I'll walk you through each of the 7 steps. Sorry. Oh, jumped ahead. Okay, so once you generate claims, how can they be used? There's a variety of uses, and it kind of depends on who the user is. So for forest managers, they can use it to promote their forests and their forest products with verified impact claims attached to them. And we've seen certificate holders use these for premiums, for procurement agreements. It can allow them access to other types of capital like thematic investments or results-based finance, both public and private. Forest managers, or really anybody in the forest value chain, from sourcing to distribution to retail, can use these in their natural capital accounting and nature-related disclosures to show how they're conducting due diligence, their assessment, their management, and reporting of nature-related topics. Sponsors can use it to promote their financial sponsorship of these impacts. They can use this to demonstrate progress toward their climate or nature positive targets. And for project developers or carbon credit buyers, those who are working with other standards, it's a way to very rigorously increase the value of those credits that show additional economic, social, and environmental safeguards that boost the integrity and the value of credits being sold, which is for those of you who aren't familiar with carbon markets, is a really important topic right now with a clear value add. Now, one really important note, and again, I'll talk about this more in the 3rd session, verified impacts claims cannot be used for offsetting, compensation, or neutralization purposes. So they cannot be used to, if a company's investing in or sponsoring outside of their value chain, they can't use claims to say, I've offset my carbon emissions or my land use consumption toward a climate neutral target. So that's an important limitation, although there's work being done right now to consider whether and how there's space for these types of claims under the procedure. What's really important to understand, and this goes back to what I was describing before about nature-related risk management, is the procedure is really set up to help organizations demonstrate their adherence to the mitigation hierarchy for managing their climate or nature-related risks. So how they measure or understand their impacts and set a baseline and get verifiable data to their measures to abate their impact through avoidance or reduction of their emissions, of their land use footprint, of their biodiversity impact, their water consumption, etc. And how they're improving their land and improving the ecosystem integrity or carbon removals or carbon storage capacity of the land that they're managing. And then how they're engaging also outside of their value chain to neutralize any residual emissions. And if any of you here are not so familiar with the mitigation hierarchy, it's a really important sort of guiding principle for the sustainability space. And I'm going to go into much more detail about it in the next session, in the 3rd session, because it's more related to sponsors and impact claims. So speaking of those sessions, we've got two more. I think I already spoke at length about them, and you can find more information online. I've included a link in the presentation. I think I've been talking quite long enough. But generally speaking, session two is for forest managers, for anyone applying the procedure, how to do it. And then the third session is how can you use claims from the procedure? How can you raise finance for impact claims? What is the value proposition for forest product retailers and other end users of verified impacts? So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope that everybody can make it to all the sessions. That's all from my side. Feel free to contact me as well if you have any follow-up questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we have time for a few questions. I don't know if there's any in the chat.
Yeah, we do have one in the chat, Wesley, and I'll read it to the best of my ability. And it's from Klaus Geiger. Hope I pronounced your last name right. It says, if I understand correctly, the Ecosystem Services Procedure, or ESP, focuses on claims and not issuing credits. Claims can vary greatly. How can FSC ensure some comparability between ESP project activities? And how do you view where ESP fits in with the existing voluntary carbon market and emerging biodiversity market? Big question.
Yeah, they're great. Those are really great questions, Klaus. I'm going to talk much more about this in session three. So how to manage the variability between claims, what is the difference between a claim and a credit? But I'll try to answer briefly now. You're correct that the procedure is about impact claims and not credits. And when I say credits, I mean environmental assets that you can own and trade. Okay. So the procedure just verifies that an impact has been generated in the forest. And if it's been sponsored, who sponsored it, and how much of the claim can be attributed to their sponsorship. But it does not give a tradable asset that companies can then trade downstream. And this was a very intentional decision. The idea being that the procedure verified impact is really there to foster very short value chains and try to avoid some of the speculation and secondary markets and trading you see in the crediting system, and really foster a much closer relationship between sponsors and the certificate holders. So that's the first one, but again, session three, much more detail. In terms of comparability between, so the procedure's set up in a way that it doesn't say only these activities qualify. It functions, I would say, very differently from a carbon crediting scheme. So it doesn't say only these activities qualify or only these methodologies qualify. This was also an intentional decision because when we talk about FSC certificate holders, we're talking about many different types of responsible management in many different geographies, with certificate holders of different sizes, capacities, resource availability, etc. And so we set up the procedure to be flexible in as long as you can show a very coherent theory of change that links your management activities to one of these impacts. As long as you can show that the methodology that you use to measure it is credible, replicable, and suitable for that context and backed up by peer-reviewed literature. And as long as there's an improvement and it's audited and it goes through the whole process, then you can verify the impact, which at the end, I think it's one thing if we're talking about carbon and one if we're talking about other services. For carbon, that was linked to carbon storage or carbon removal. So X tons of carbon removed from the atmosphere per year attributable to certain activities, which is very similar and very coherent with the voluntary carbon market. For other services, it's a little more flexible, but also because the guidance for nature-related commitments has not yet been finalized. But for sure, the procedure's set up in a way that will allow companies who are pursuing nature positive targets or commitments to verify their impacts on biodiversity, water, and all of the different opportunities for addressing nature loss. And I hope I didn't wake up your baby with that long-winded response. I hope it's clear.
I think that was clear. I don't see any other, oh wait, headphones, yes, good class. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody want to hold up their hand to ask a question instead of typing? Okay. I don't see any hands up or any more questions in the chat. I do want to announce, let's see, I'll do that one now. Are there any Jake wants to know, are there any existing marketplaces in the US to monetize these services?
It depends on what you mean by marketplace. So I would say that there are platforms. How do I say this? The next couple of sessions are going to talk a lot more about how to raise finance and get sponsorship for claims. The short answer is that I would say all ecosystem service markets are very fragmented, very sort of one-on-one or B2B deals. There's very few organizing platforms. There are registries, for example, in carbon markets, but they're not very intuitive and they're not really there to link potential sponsors or buyers and impacts on the ground. It's really something that forest managers, before and as they're applying the procedure, need to understand and make a business case for and understand the marketing and outreach and communication needs to access these markets. And buyers need to send a very clear signal about what kind of sponsors or impacts that they're looking for. We have a e-commerce platform called Wow Nature. I'll try to send a link or I'll put it in the presentation. But this platform is set up exactly for this purpose. So to say, if you're a company that's pursuing a sustainability objective, or you're a forest manager that is trying to access these markets, we put together our own space for bringing them together. I'm sure that there's something comparable in the States, but I couldn't name it for you.
Alex had a question, and I think Sean, you're probably the best one to answer that about the recording.
Sorry, I had to figure out where the mute button is. Yes, we can send the recording out, and we can also, I believe, send a copy or a link to a copy of Wes's presentation as well.
Yeah, and we're undergoing a complete rebuild of our FSC US website. So that's why I didn't say we're going to post on the website, because we're completely taking the old one apart and putting a new one together. It's version 2013. I would love to invite, if she's still here, Laura St. Peter, or did she already go? Nope, Laura's still here. I'd invite her to share some exciting news with you. We have not had until recently a ecosystem services impact demonstrated in the US. Laura St. Peter and their group at Forest Carbon Works, which is an FM certificate holder with FSC in the US, actually did just apply the procedure and had it audited back in December of last year, and they're getting their okay from their CB very soon. But I'll invite Laura to just take a minute or two and make an announcement there, Laura.
Well, thank you, Tom. I feel like I'm at the Oscars and I have to get out a, crumpled piece of paper, but I appreciate the support. Also just want to say a quick hello to Kara and Klaus, former coworkers. So hello in a virtual space. Yeah, we're excited to finally have the approval for verified impacts for our certificate scope. We've applied the biodiversity conservation, restoration of the natural forest cover on our portion of our FSC certificate lands down in the southeast, where we're working it's an afforestation project under gold standard, but we utilize FSC as a dual certification clause that you had mentioned in your comments as well. But anyways, the ecosystem services procedure, verified impacts just fit really, really well and aligned, with our values as a company. We're also longtime champions of FSC in general, and we're just excited to kind of add that as another feather in our cap, and to kind of really promote to our credit buyers. We're a nature-based carbon credit removal company, and we get a lot of kind of questions and excitement about our properties being FSC certified. So now we get to kind of now announce that we have this biodiversity impact that we also get to state that is third-party audited. Yes, we self-promote it, but now to have FSC's credibility behind that is just an excellent thing that we're really excited to promote. And Wesley, I definitely reviewed, when building our own procedure, the public documents that Etifor has on their website, and Tom, you had passed that along as well too. So, definitely use that as kind of a good, not resource, but just kind of seeing, how, it was a resource. I didn't copy and paste, I promise. There's no plagiarism. But anyways, it was a huge help, and certainly appreciate your time presenting with these series. I'll definitely be joining the next two, and yeah, we're just excited to be in that same space. So
Thanks, Laura.
Tom.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So, our first one in North America. Yes, we got one. Congratulations to the crew over there. Say hi to Chris for me, McLaren, next time you see him, and my old boss. He's a good guy, and I know he's always been a good champion for FSC. Let's see. We don't have any other questions. I would encourage you guys, if you found this session as interesting as I did, that you promote it with all your friends throughout your network, so that we can get more people here to hear what Wesley's got to say in the next two sessions, the next 2 weeks. Hope to see you all again. And don't think there's any more questions that we missed. Dual certification. Yeah, the only thing with when it gets into the carbon world, you can't have a carbon credit and a carbon claim at the same time. But if you're like Forest Carbon Works, you can be selling carbon credits in a voluntary or regulated market and have a different type of ecosystem services claim like they did with biodiversity or water. You just can't have carbon on top of carbon. That's double counting. I think that gets to all the questions. Thank you all very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next week and the week after. Have a nice day, everybody.